Good afternoon, everyone. So this lunch debate will be in English because there are some participants who are English speaking. So this is a lunch debate that will be about migration. And if we heard the word migration, we think about perhaps the elections. We think about the migration crisis in 2015. We think perhaps the recent creation of a government in the Netherlands, where indeed there will be a harsh migration politics. And perhaps we forget that migration has always been a part of our culture. So a lot of Flemish people went during the religious wars to the Netherlands, so that Louis Paul Boon once said that the Dutch people or Flemish people who have forgotten it. And a lot of people who are living in the Flemish region came from the French society. So migration has always been a case, and also a lot of people from our side have traveled to the United States, and some of them came back, and some indeed have found a job there, and Steven Debaere is one of them. He went to the United States, and he is there now, professor in the Virginia University. He is among us because we have with Lias a gathering of people who are discussing the water problem. So it's indeed today a day where we have a lot of water, but there are also moments where there is a scarcity of water, and so that kind of thing is also one of the specialization. But he is here among us to talk about his family and about his experiences about migration. And then Anna Gobin will, Sara Cosemans will give then a kind of command. So I give the floor to Peter.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here. All right, so as you see, I want to talk about migration to the United States, right? And I will want to go back in time to then, from that position in time, look at some of the issues that we face today, right? So migration is a defining topic in our time, and it's also very delicately intertwined with my personal life, as you could hear, right? So on the one hand, I am Belgian, but I'm an immigrant. I moved to the United States so almost 30 years ago, right? So I'm now a chair professor at a top US business school at the University of Virginia, right? Which like the KU Leuven, right, has many students and faculty who stem from abroad. Right, so I'm also an international economist, right? So I worked on globalization, right? And globalization is currently experiencing a backlash, right? So there's no denying about this, and this backlash is probably going to last for a while, right? Since it's related to changing geopolitics, it's related to, especially in the United States, to inequality, to the aftermath of the recession, right? The Great Recession, and the pandemic. So the backlash has also affected, indeed, how we think about migration, right? In general, there is a consensus that really the US migration system is in need of reform, right? So it also is underfunded and can't handle the influx of people at the southern border who want or who seek asylum. Right, so there is this backlash, and we actually don't think that there'll be a reform of that US migration system soon, since, yes, indeed, it is an election year, and migration is certainly a topic. Right, so and it's in this context that I started looking back at the past, and it has changed somewhat how I think about some of the migration issues that we face. And so what I'll do is, first I'll contextualize a little bit the context where I started looking at the past, and that relates to my family. Then I'll try to argue why looking at the past might actually be relevant, and then I'll draw some tentative conclusions or takeaways from that historical comparison. Right? So here is the looking back. It started basically almost as an accident, right? So an uncle of mine died, and my brother, who's an historian, right, uncovered letters, he uncovered pictures, right, he uncovered documents from my grandmother. And so we did know as children that my grandmother had gone to the United States, right? So these were her trunks and they were in my parents' bedroom. But apart from that, we actually did not really know much. We knew she had been there as a maid, right? So, and what we did during the pandemic is actually we tried to retrace her steps and we wrote a book about this, right? So to America and back again, right? Because of course she did return, otherwise I would not be standing here. So, and critical in this setup was this little address book, right? That was like an index of the social context of a maid, right? An immigrant maid with very little education. Of course, as an economist, I wanted to especially also see whether I could frame that story of her in the in the context of migration. But I mean, soon enough, as we started digging, right, we noticed that we would face a particular challenge, and that challenge was that. And let me give you an example. This challenge was actually to get back into the perspective of a maid of that time. And just as an example, even before she left, right, this was right after the First World War, right, so Belgium was devastated, right, so she, like many Flemish people, went across the border, right, she spent some time in France, she worked for the Ennebic family, and Ennebic was in fact a fixture in the world exhibitions, right, he was a pioneer in the development of reinforced concrete, right? So, and he was also the one who designed this eccentric house with this 40-meter high tower, right? To basically showcase what one could do with reinforced concrete. Now, we were very excited when we uncovered this, right? So, and we found the plan of that house, and that plan, in a way, lays out the challenge, because what you see is you see the house, right? You see also, I know this is relatively small, you see people who are dressed up very well, right? Somebody with a beard, maybe Mr. Ennebic, his family, his children, right? But you find the maids as well, and I circled them, right? So in the bowels of the building, next to the bathroom, right? And in the attic, right? So and the challenge of this whole enterprise was really to uncover the position of a maid. So as I said, so as we dug into this story, I especially wanted to know, as an economist, you know, how or whether we could frame her story or place her story in the remarkable history of US migration, right? And so I was, of course, aware that there are certain parallels, at least in the statistics, between the 1920s and now, in terms of the fraction of US population that actually is born abroad. You see that, yes, it has reached similar heights now, right, in the US and in Belgium as it was at the time. Obviously, very different from Belgium. That's a relatively young or recent migration land, right? What you do see is that you have this incredible spike of migration, right, early on, right? So there you have, in a way, a natural experiment that whose result that we saw unfold, right? So, and I thought or wondered whether we could tap or connect her story to that. Now, of course, I constantly, of course, the question is whether and how, going back in time to the 1920s, whether that could be, why this would be relevant for current migration debates, right? And maybe this picture is a good starting point. It looks initially like a very pedestrian picture, right? So you have 4 women, 4 maids sitting together with a little boy, right? So this is, of course, during the 1920s, right? This is around 1925, the Roaring '20s, where there's huge income inequality, right? This is the time of the Great Gatsby, right? And so the little boy is the little butler, right? So, and this was the son of a very rich family, and yes, indeed, during that time, my grandmother worked as a maid for rich people, right? So they owned, the Butlers owned an investment bank, and they owned an investment bank in New York, right? So how do we make a connection here then with now? Well, so if you actually start digging and you start reading up also in the census, what you do find, right, what you do find is that there's always a set of immigrants that are her colleagues that come from the same sets of countries, right? So they come from Belgium, from Germany, from France, or from Scandinavia. And in a way, this is a bit remarkable, because at the time, since 1900, it were really the vast majority of immigrants were not from there. They were actually coming from Southern Europe or from Eastern Europe, many of them Jewish. And you don't find them working for rich people. And so once you start thinking about this and you're reading up on this, you see that at the time this was not only a very hierarchical situation, right, a very hierarchical society, you saw also that within the immigrant communities, there were vast differences between where the immigrants were actually coming from, right? And so certainly the immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe, they would not be working, at least the women, right, as maids, but they would rather work in factories, right? So, and especially also, the Italian community was at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? So, and you even have a reporting of some lynchings in the end of the 19th century, right? So clearly this was a very hierarchical situation, right? And so you may wonder how this could be relevant for now. Well, I think that when candidate for President Trump, right, when he basically attacks and vilifies migrants, right, when he says they come from shit countries, right, that he brings us back to this time, right, to the 1920s. Why? Also, I should say, right, so as you probably heard that, he has a program for if he wins the presidency, right, so in which he would crack down on migration, right, so he would deport millions of people, would reconsider some aspects of legal migration, right, and even maybe ponder about the birthright. So when he does these kinds of attacks, he brings us back to that period, I think, right, because on the one hand, the 1920s is actually a period where a crackdown on migration did start, right, so a massive 85% reduction in migration numbers did occur, right? And it's also the case, right, that this was a period of fairly open xenophobia, right? Eugenics was fairly well established, right? So, and where you actually came from did matter. And if you look at the migration policies, right, you see they imposed quotas for immigrants, right? You see that they explicitly were such that they should favor the immigrants from Northern Europe, right, Western Europe, at the expense of those coming from Eastern and Southern. We shouldn't forget also that this was the time when, if you weren't from Europe, it was already very difficult to even get into the United States, right? So in 1882, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act that basically banned people from China and then later Asia from actually coming or reaching the United States, right? So so the important part to say is that, and that's a bit the gist of the line of argument, is that before we get too tempted by a crackdown on migration, maybe it's worthwhile to take a look at how people actually lived, right? So how this integration of immigrants actually did occur, and what actually some of these impacts are of or were of the crackdown on migration, right? So that's what we want to do. So when you embark on this endeavor, right, that you face a certain obstacle, and that is that European migration tends to be romanticized, right? People cherish their European heritage. I mean, you saw it probably that when Biden went to Ireland, right? So this was big news, and he cherished his heritage. He was certainly not the first one to do, right? So Robert Kennedy, already as a senator, wrote a book, A Nation of Immigrants, right? He was of Irish stock, right? And so it's about the case that after World War II, since after World War II, right, so the US referred to itself as a nation of immigrants, right? So also here, we cherish European migration, right? So in Antwerp was really the port of exit, right, on the way out. Now, so the issue is, yes, there are about 80 million people in the United States that are direct descendants of European immigrants, right? So, and they fit in like a glove, so to speak, right? So they're a self-evident part of the US fabric, right? So, and one tends to forget that early on, this wasn't such an easy story, that there were actually very stark differences between these European migrants, right? And so the issue is a little bit that if one forgets and homogenizes European immigrants like this, that one will tend to overemphasize the differences in the mix of immigrants that we have these days, where you know that there's an increased fraction of non-European immigrants in all the flows of immigrants in the United States, and that's also true in Europe. All right, so let's see. So maybe what can we learn from the past when we look at stories like this? And I start with a postcard here from the Belgian Bureau. Right, this is a remarkable institution. It's actually an institution where my grandmother worked before as a maid before she went to work for the richer people. Right, so and it was a few priests and some staff, and their function was really to help, to assist, to support Belgian immigrants. Right, so they offered the community. They helped with the searching for a job. Right, so, and this was also an organization that played a role in the massive relief effort, right, during World War I, right, when Hoover tried to prevent starvation in Belgium. Right, so the point is that an organization like this was not unique, right? You had them from all different countries where people came from, right? And oftentimes these were official. The Belgian Bureau was just a private enterprise, right? So, so it was clearly the case that, look, there were some support systems in place. A very important support system was also the clustering, right, of immigrants. For Belgium, this was around Detroit, right, and also not too far from Chicago in Illinois, right? And in there, people could find their footing in such clusters, right? You could even speak Flemish. You even had a Gazette van Detroit, right? So where you could read, you could find a partner. So there were really ways in which you could find your footing as an immigrant. But things went even further than that, right? So certainly after the project of the Great Society, right, immigrants, European immigrants, had access, right, to the benefits of the welfare state, right? So unemployment, social security. So that was part of the deal. Before that, even, right, especially in the Northeast, right, it was the case that European immigrants also had access to relief organizations. Now, why am I saying this? Because there's this sense that European immigrants did it by themselves, right? So and clearly that's not the case, right? So everybody, including the immigrants, needed support, right? It's also the case, and a colleague of mine at the University of Virginia has worked on this, has also shown that, yes, among European immigrants, right, there were also quite a few who were illegal, right? And they got support from the community to actually legalize their own position, right? So that's one thing that puts a bit in perspective, gives some nuance to the can-do immigrants who pull themselves up by this shoelaces, so to speak. The second thing I would like to start from is point to this document here. This is the document from the ship, right? The USS France that brought my grandmother to New York in 1921. Right, so we find her here. It actually took us quite a while to find her because instead of Remery, right, her name was Anna Remery, here it's Anna Chemery. So there was a misspelling, so we didn't find her right away. Now, the point is that basically for all immigrants, right, so you have lots of information available, right? So you have millions and millions of records, and not only in the ship's documents, but also, right, in census, and these are all available online. Now, colleagues from Princeton and Stanford, Abramitsky and Bustam, they have actually used big data to analyze those, right? So there's some very interesting things that come across, right? So whatever one may think about European migration, right? So it turns out, whether you think it's that the integration was slow or fast, it turns out that they claim that basically current migrants integrate at the same pace as they did, right? So, and they have different measures that they basically use for these millions of records, right? They look at, for example, the extent to which migrants live in their own ethnic community or leave that community, whether they marry in that community or marry outside of it, right? They look at whether there's an Americanization of the names that occurs, right? It starts very fast within one family already, within siblings, right? So it's the case that this very quickly starts. They look at language acquisition. Basically, it takes one generation for the language acquisition to occur, and they look also at economic integration, right? So, and that obviously hangs together with the language acquisition because it's an incentive to do well, and typically, that's one of their important takeaways is basically it's the children, right? The children of the migrants that really catch up, right? So they are the ones who make the so interesting, irrespective of how one views cherishes or not European migration, right? It looks like that the speed of integration, right, between current migrants and those coming from Europe in the past, right, is comparable. Now, a third point. So I put my did I forget when I showed the, I did. Can I click back? I should have pointed out. So this here is my grandmother, right, who's sitting at the upper stair, right? So this is Anna Remery, right? So here we have another picture of her, right? So, and I pair her with a favorite immigrant, right, Albert Einstein, right? And so you could say, look, she doesn't really have much in common. She does not have much in common with Einstein. That may be true, but there's one thing that she did have in common. She certainly did not displace local workers, because the job as a domestic servant was actually not very desired. I mean, there was huge demand, right? So one called it the servants problem. There was huge demand for domestic servants, but there was little supply. So basically what happened is that the vast majority of people in those jobs were migrants, right? So, and this was not a very attractive job because, look, you didn't have any privacy, you lived in, right? You were on call all day, you had no contract, you were at the whims of the lady of the house, right? And then there was, in some instances, also sexual abuse going on. So this is not a very attractive job, right? And this is something worth emphasizing, right? So that's, yes, it is not the case that all migrant jobs necessarily, right, will put downward pressure on wages of local people, right? Because it's not the case that the migrants are easy substitutes for the locals, right? So, this brings us, this is important to notice for two things. One is that you actually can design, right, an immigration system that takes this into account and tries to minimize the impact on the local population, right? And so the other part is that it also gets us to, in a way, one of the puzzles that economists have when they think about migration. They actually don't find much downward pressure on wages, right? If at all. Right, and so you may wonder why this is, and it is actually because there is a very strong demand for high-skilled migrants. Right, so high-skilled migrants, right, are really, really looked after. Right, so high-skilled migrants actually also play an important part in the economy. Many of the top companies, Tesla, Google, are run by migrants, right? So it's also the case that Nobel Prizes, a very large fraction in the United States, are coming from migrants. But this is not only the case for high-skilled labor. For low-skilled labor, that is the case as well. There is high demand for migrants with a low skill level of education, right, in agriculture and in the health sector. So that increasingly, that's the puzzle that economists have, right, that migrants have, from an economic point of view, a fairly strong case to make that in no way rationalizes the vitriol that you actually see, right? So in addition, right, in aging societies, there will be increasing demand in the healthcare and the service sector. Right, so it's not very hard to see why this is the case, right? So this is a graph based on a very famous paper by Otto and Dawn, and it basically gives you can focus on the orange line, right? The demand for labor for different types of occupations, right, by skill. So you have very low skill and very high skill there. So what you see is that has been an increase in demand, right? Increase in the demand at the high and at the low skill level. This is the polarization of demand. So this gives you a sense why it is the case that you don't necessarily have to have this downward pressure on wages if it's the case that for high skilled labor and for low skilled labor there is this very strong demand. All right, so I have then, of course, right, so after making the case for immigrants, talk a little bit also then about, since this is what we hear now, right, the need to crack down on migration, right, and indeed, as I said, in the 1920s, there was really a drastic reduction in migration, right? So you have a natural experiment to see how this actually pans out, right? So the surprising thing for some may be that actually the locals do not necessarily benefit from such a crackdown, right? So what you see in the countryside is especially there are more machines that are being used instead of migrants. Right, so this is the time where you didn't have outsourcing, so they cannot outsource more, so machines are used. Some sectors, heavy in in migrants like mining, they are on decline, right? And then you see that actually migrants from other countries come in. I did not emphasize this, but while there were these strong restrictions on migration from Europe and other countries, it was the case that in the Americas there was no restriction, right? So in what you did see is that, yes, there was a high increase, a significant increase in migration from these countries, right? So let me add a graph to it that points to recent times, right? So we have had Brexit, right? For many economists, Brexit really didn't make much economic sense, right? This decision to leave the EU, from economic point of view, it's very hard to find a rationale, unless you start thinking that, yes, maybe the rationale was explicitly to reduce migration, right? So that was probably the main driver. And so you get a little bit of a sense that is in line with what was found in the 1920s, that the same is going on in Brexit, right? After Brexit, this is the orange line is the total net migration. So in what you've seen that the total net migration has spiked up after Brexit, right? So sure, it is the case that migration from the EU has gone down, but migration from non-EU countries, right, has spiked up, right? And this is in line with what I just mentioned, that yes, there is a very strong demand, right, for migrant labor, high-skilled and low-skilled, in advanced economies, right? So this basically brings me to the conclusion, right? Says that migration is hard work. It takes time, and it's also an investment. It's an investment especially in the next generation, right? Migrants, they do integrate, but they don't do everything on their own. They can use some help. There's a strong economic case to be made for migrants. There's the economic data do not rationalize the vitriol that you see these days. So and if you look at the impact, you would say, look, this is an argument for reforming the migration system, but certainly not. And we haven't even talked about some of the inflation implications that would be a consequence if you really shut down migration, right? So, so this would be an argument for reforming the system rather than cracking down on migration. Of course, migration policy is best set or reflecting the consensus, right, in a country. I would submit that in those discussions, especially when migration is part of culture wars, that it may pay off to pragmatically start playing or making very clearly these economic arguments of the case for migration, emphasize the contributions of migrants, identifies ourselves as migrants, and bring in individual perspectives.
Thank you very much, Steven, for your wonderful presentation. I have read the book already, and I can definitely recommend it because so many things come to the fore that are really important. And I'm going to give an academic perspective briefly, shortly. We can talk about it more in the questions, but I really want to start with a provocative statement. In today's fear-mongering about migration, the impression is set that migration is ever rising, that the world is more mobile than ever before, and that through globalization, the entire world arrives at our doorstep. My provocative counterpoint is that over the past century, mobility has been more reduced than ever before. The system in which we live today is more restrictive than any other point in human history. And why is that? Steven already referred to it. Oh, Peter, sorry. Yeah, I had a lecture by his brother, who also co-authored the book with Steven. My apologies. Peter already referred to it, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a piece of legislation in the United States that really had a global impact. What did it do? For the first time in history, it installed a system in which migration was controlled remotely. So the United States would have a consulate and an embassy in China that was to give out permissions to travel. We know them today as visa. Our world today is structured along the lines of that system. It was installed at the end of the 19th century, and by the end of the First World War, it gets internationalized. For the first time in history, we have a global system of migration control. Completely new. This has never been the case before. This system of passports and visas, which we all know today, has very racist grounds. It was installed to keep Chinese migrants out of the United States because up until that point, the rate of Chinese migration equaled the rate of European migration. And American legislators were afraid that instead of a white nation, the United States would become an Asian nation. Very possible, given the fact that the two oceans supplied migrants from both sides. But this racist language is not very useful to build legislation upon. So instead of radicalizing the racist language, they bureaucratized this process. And they actually installed a system so that it applies not only to Chinese, but also to everyone else. The fact that there is so much documentation of migrants, that all this documentation is available online, and that we can trace them from where they embarked to where they disembarked and what they did afterwards, is exactly the fact that these entire processes were bureaucratized. And that is something that we have never seen in human history before. Humans migrate. It is a fundamental part of humanity. Without migratory movements, there wouldn't be humans all over the world, right? So humans move, and that in itself is not a very surprising statement. What is surprising is that we have come to accept a world in which this movement is controlled from all sides. And this has important implications. In 1959, the philosopher Hannah Arendt, you know her, wrote, "Of all the specific liberties which may come into our minds when we hear the word freedom, freedom of movement is historically the oldest and also the most elementary." And she continued, "As limitation of freedom of movement has from time immemorial been the precondition for enslavement." What she meant by the quote was that when people encounter difficult situations, they move away. When people seek opportunities, they move away. That has been an historical reaction to whatever is going on in your environment. And when that freedom of movement is reduced, it creates situations in which people are criminalized for being human, for moving, for seeking opportunities. Now then, why do we tell a story of the 20th century as the most mobile century that we have known? Part of it is that we have forgotten about movements in the past, right? Even though archaeological research shows that there is a lot of mobility, that there was, for instance, that Americans moved much more widely than they do today, it is forgotten. That is one part of it. The other part of it is that we are still mobile, despite restrictions. And here I will come to a point that also shines through in Peter's story, which is that migration is often a highly personal choice, which is sought by people with very entrepreneurial minds, with very strong desires to move, but also to seek opportunities for themselves. And the Dutch sociologist Hein de Haas, whom you might know because he has been in the news here in Belgium also recently with a Dutch book for the wider audience about migration, where he debunks a lot of migration myths. He talks in this regard about the aspirations, capabilities framework. People will always have aspirations to move, and whether they can move or not is dependent on the capabilities for movement. But these capabilities, importantly, are not only decided by our migratory system. It also has to do with people's own capabilities, intellectually, economically, politically, and so on. And it also has to do with how people find ways navigating difficult systems. Now, if we bring that to today, what an interesting idea it could be to look at migrants, wherever they come from today, from the point of this aspirations capabilities network. Because if we can harvest the skills, the aspirations, the capabilities of people who come here, what a world we can build. Thinking back about human history that always has been mobile. I end with another controversial point. What I am pleading for here in front of you is not a world of open borders, because, you know, anti-migration voices are often yelling about open borders and the left, and no. What I am asking you to consider is how this system of reduced mobility with passports and visas and bureaucratic controls that only is 100 years old, only a century old, how we can rethink that entire system. Not the migration system, but the system that requires this structure of borders and mobility control. And that is linked to the way we organize nation states, we organize social security systems, the way we think about support systems. I think we might be at a point where we need to consider all of these aspects together. Migration is not an unconnected element. And with that thought, I leave you for the discussion.
So perhaps you can sit on the table and people can ask questions. There comes a micro with you that's for the recording, so it is not amplifying it.
As far as migration is concerned, the US often contrasted with Europe as being more open to migrants, that migrants take a more positive attitude towards the country that they go to. Europe is not necessarily their first choice, but for a lot of American immigrants to the United States, America was the dream that they wanted to go to and make into a reality. But it seems that more recently the attitude in the United States towards migration has changed somewhat, and this positive attitude is no longer there. Can you say whether this is true or not, and is there an explanation for that? And the other part of the question is the United States has tremendously benefited from the migrants, also because it was a huge country that, you know, in their view was sort of empty because they forgot about the indigenous population, apparently. So they wanted to populate it, whereas in many European countries the sense is that we're very densely populated. We don't necessarily need a lot of extra people from that point of view. We also think that we have many of the skills that some other countries like Canada and Australia and New Zealand are still desperately seeking. So they have an active policy of attracting certain migrants, not all, of course. So do you think that also accounts for some of the difference between the attitudes in the US versus Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to what's happening in the United States, right? So surveys do show that there is still a fairly strong support for migration, but this is to be interpreted in the context of a polarized society, right? So there is often a particular party associated with this. It is the case that, and this is probably entirely new, that there are pressures now also on reducing potentially legal migration, right? So much of the animosity stems or is related to undocumented workers or asylum seekers, right? So who are, and I want to emphasize this, as this is really only a relatively small fraction of migrants, right? So certainly in the United States, in the context, or if you ask why it's the case that there is this backlash more generally against globalization and migration, it also has something to do with inequality. But the strange thing is a little bit, is that certainly for the United States, is that you can link, I mean, for one, there are many causes for inequality, right? So taxation matters, access to education matters. But it's the case that, yes, the openness to trade does matter, right? So, and that there has been an increase in inequality associated with more trade. The irony is, however, that for migration, it is very hard to make that argument, right? So people can confuse the impact of trade versus the impact of migration, but yes, certainly the pushback against migration in a polarized society, I think, has its roots in this increased inequality, even though it's hard to link it directly to migration.
May I speak Dutch? Ik denk dat de migratieproblematiek in de huidige samenleving West-Europa veel te maken heeft met het geboortecijfer, waarbij de bevolking op termijn dalend is. Als u daarboven een immigratie voegt van andere culturen, denk ik persoonlijk dat de combinatie tussen laag geboortecijfer, gelijkblijvende of stijgende immigratie een zodanige druk legt op de socioculturele aspecten van een samenleving, dat dit de verklaring is waarom de bevolking in algemene zin in Europa meer schuift naar een anti-immigratiehouding. En dat aspect heb ik niet gehoord in uw uiteenzetting.
Yeah. I could also answer in... Yes, so to reiterate the question, the question is, when once you have a declining birth rates in your indigenous population and you have an increasing migration and perhaps also increasing birth rates among migrants, doesn't that put a lot of pressure on social cultural aspects of your society, so that anti-immigrant sentiments stem from there? Yes, I think that is the case. And we know that since the 1970s in Belgian cities, we have not a positive, the local population cannot replace itself by its own birth rate, right? So we know that cities would simply wither away if it were not for migration in an economic sense. And a very beautiful example of this is the city of Tongeren, where you can see migrations throughout time, and where you see that the city flourishes in times that the population is bigger and grows due to migration from abroad, and that the city simply disappears or has a very negative declining pattern when people move away from the town. So in an economic sense, in order to maintain cities in Western Europe, but also in the United States, you need sustained migration. That's the economic part of it. a city like Antwerp cannot prosper without incoming migrants. There is simply not enough replacement through natural birth rates. Now, another element of this is the social-cultural part. Living together is not so easy. That's always the case. And it takes a generation or sometimes two for people to be on the same footing. Now, remarkably, is that a lot of socio-economic unease, socio-cultural unease, also occurs in places with very little migration. For instance, in what they call the golden ring around Antwerp, the small towns around Antwerp, Schilde, Scholte, these towns, where you have almost no migration, but very high anti-migration sentiments. So what dynamic is playing out there is another question than simply making the relationship between these migrants are there and the sentiment is there. There are very different dynamics at play. And I'm not sure whether I can fully answer what is going on, but it's very interesting to see that the relationship of the sentiments is not one-on-one with the experience of migrants. So that is something to consider.
So let me add that I do think my talk exactly speaks to that. What was my argument? I was basically saying from an economic point of view, right? From an economic point of view, there is no reason whatsoever, right? So it's very hard to rationalize the vitriol against migrants. From an economic point, it's not. So what's the implication? That basically it's much more these cultural aspects that play the role, right? And that's why I emphasize also the importance of looking at this issue about integration of migrants, right? So it does happen. It takes time. So and even if one cherishes the European migration, right, it is not the case that its integration has happened overnight. It hasn't. It needed time as well. And basically, as these indicators do indicate that, look, the current migration goes equally slow or equally fast as that. Yeah, but yes, so that's why I said for economists, it's puzzling to see the type of vitriol. We can't explain it unless, of course, you say, look, it's justified by cultural aspects. But then I indicate that actually, yes, migrants to integrate, it takes time. I mean, it's also the case, and maybe that's the last point. The way I look at it is basically migration is a contract between a country and people who come. So you do have freedom, if you're able to reform, right, to set the terms of that contract, right? And this is one of the problems in the United States, that it's a very, very rigid system of migration, right? Where you cannot tailor, right? You cannot tailor the influx of migration to particular situations, or we're not willing to change it or to attach conditions, right? So if you look at migration from that point of view, you can see it as a contract where you, as a society in a discussion, right, can set the terms, right? So that's why I think it's very important to have a public debate about migration, but that should also include that some people make the case for why migration is important, right? So, and why cracking down on migration may not necessarily deliver all the promises that people think it will.
To continue on this issue, the message a lot of people get from right-wing parties is that the migration is very devastating also economically. And so we have had in Metaforum different kinds of working groups on the issue of migration, and we often invited people from the economy faculty to come up with indeed your argument that migration is positive for the economy. But they were hesitant to participate, perhaps because they were not busy with that particular issue, but also because they say, or they suggest that there is not yet a kind of consensus among economists. So the message you are bringing sounds very interesting and nice and important, but how is it with the consensus among the economists about this issue?
Certainly in the United States, I think that's the consensus opinion, that basically for high-skilled migration, it's very hard to see whether there are any drawbacks to it. There is, yeah. And for low-skilled, right, so if sometimes you may see a little dip short-term in wages, but in many studies you don't, and it's certainly if you look over a longer time period, you will not have it.
And so if the consensus is there, why is there not communication towards the public so that they grasp that is in their favor to be more positive towards migration?
My sense is, and this is, I can only speak for the United States, and maybe this is the same case here, that in the United States there's very few people, I find, that openly take the position, right, defending or making the economic case for migrants, right? So you don't, people find it risky, right? You may open yourself up to criticism, right? And one could say that maybe there's a need, since if one believes that a societal debate about migration is important, that then also people speak up and bring those arguments that are supportive of migration. But it seems like people are reluctant to do that, right? So, and that's why I think like universities, where a big fraction of the faculty of students are coming from, could see themselves maybe trying to make that clear, that actually migrants do play an important role, right? So, or one can come out and say, look, I'm a migrant, like myself, I'm a migrant, I'm a church professor at the university, I do contribute something to the country where I'm a guest. I mean, and now I'm a US citizen in the meantime as well.
But to link that to my story, I think what we should consider and what we don't think of enough is how over the last century migration has been framed consistently as something very negative. And that has never before been the case. And we think we live in a world with a lot of migration, but we live in a very restricted world and we are not even aware of it. We don't, I wonder how many of you considered that our passport system is only 100 years old and that it had a moment of origin, but also perhaps a limitation in terms of when the system just collapses and cannot be upheld. And when we are living in a time frame, we often don't see the structural elements that surround us, because these structural elements are all encompassing, so you don't have to question them, right? But it is in moments of big ruptures, big debates, crisis, that things change. And so the First World War definitely was such a moment, and it is afterwards that the system is installed. Now we live in it for 100 years, and we don't consider that this is the system that structures all of our lives. Not only the Bangladeshis who are on a boat on the Mediterranean, but also our lives, right? And so in order to understand the negativity around migration, I also think we need to consider that we live in a time frame, in a century in which migration was framed in a very negative light. And so to speak against it is immediately counteracting the current you're in. And that is not so easy to do, but it is the societal obligation of universities to always question the status quo. And so I think that's why I tell you that I state very controversial statements. I know that many in the room have not considered it and also do not agree with me. But what if we don't discuss these things? I think it is really important to be very counterintuitive in certain ways. Yeah.
Question? Yeah, Philippe?
That I'm not an expert in migration, therefore my question may be stupid, but when I look at the situation in Belgium and in most European countries, it is not an issue that one is against high skilled migration. As a matter of fact, many countries in the European Union are actively trying to recruit high skilled migration. Where the discussion is about low skilled migration and the feeling that too many migrants are entering our borders. And there, in the European context, is often also that there is a social-cultural element playing an important role, meaning that, in particular, one accepts that this migration comes from other EU countries or countries similar in Europe, but one has not so positive feelings on particular illegal migration or whatever coming from Africa and so on. So there the social cultural element matters. I think you see that also in the difference between the attitude, let's say, in Antwerp and Leuven. In Leuven there is not much discussion about migration. How many of you, your children, are in classes with people who are children from expats who work here around Leuven, high-skilled migration? If you go to the problems in Antwerp or whatever, it is often the problems, low-skilled migration, at least in the first stage, and then, as a matter of fact, after a certain time, the cultural element also plays a role. So I think that is a situation that one observes. I wouldn't say that Europe or the United States is very necessarily anti-migration, but it very much depends what type of migration you're looking at, and for the lower skilled migration, from where they are coming.
Yes, and I think, well, I disagree with you on the fact that low-skilled migration is controversial among employers, for instance. We are very, very actively recruiting in countries like Morocco and other African nations, nurses from Bangladesh, these countries in Belgium. And if you ask VOCA, they would find it a horrible idea to crack down on migration because, you know, employers' organizations know very well that we need low-skilled migrations. As much as we do high-skilled migration. And when we're talking about the social cultural thing, then of course you have all kinds of fears coming up about our culture being under threat. And I think I can fulminate about it that it is a racist thing. I will not, because I don't think that is the case necessarily. But I do think that what we really need is to debate this in ways that we can get to know each other and that we also can see how relatively quickly people are integrated in the social fabric of a society. How the Dutch language will be proliferated by Moroccans of the second generation in Antwerp, for instance. But it is a problem of access. Access in both ways. We live with each other, but not, we live alongside each other, but often not with each other, not knowing each other very well. But also, as long as you have discrimination on the employment market, discrimination in education, discrimination on the housing market, you separate people from society. And in order to integrate them fast, I think inclusion and a debate about it is really necessary. Because when you build a strong coalition in which people can be included, it is impossible not to influence one another, and it is impossible not to share culture with one another. And the United States is a perfect example of that. You can build a strong society with strong patriotic sentiments with people with very different backgrounds. You just have to make sure that you do have that conversation and that you don't shy away from it, but that you engage in that debate. Because at the end of the day, migration is there, it will not disappear no matter what people say, and it's also not desirable if you ask employers.
I think we need to end. We are already 7 minutes over our time, which is not a habit. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Thank you for the questions.